use their main damaging ability in raids anyway, and they'd be stuck with only Holy Strike every 10 seconds. Because in beta, when Paladins had both Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, Judgment and Seals didn't really exist in the way they did in Vanilla WoW. Beta Judgment was literally just Holy Wrath, where it was an AoE that only worked on undeads. And when they changed the Paladin class to how it eventually worked in Vanilla WoW, they changed Judgment into the 8-second cooldown ability, which consumed Seals in order to do damage. And then they just added in Holy Wrath, which had Judgment's old effect. And the Seal system was completely added to the game along with this Judgment change, where the Seal system in Vanilla WoW requires you to activate a short-term buff on yourself, which is usually about 30 seconds, and then you consume that 30-second buff with your Judgment in order to do damage, and other various effects. And while that 30-second buff is on you, it gives you an auto-attack buff, which does various things depending on which seal you're using. And the things in Beta WoW, which were called seals, were just changed into the blessings, which is kind of confusing to explain in this video, but to make it as simple as possible, they completely created the seal mechanic from scratch at the start of Vanilla WoW, and then for some reason gave it a naming convention after another set of abilities that Paladins already had, that functions nothing like how the seal mechanic works. Anyways, since they didn't have the Seal and Judgment mechanic alongside Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, they never really got to test how that would function for the class, allowing them to have 3 damaging abilities that they would then use regularly along with the auto attack buff from Seals. Considering that system would still have the mana problems and the debuff slot limit problem, I can see why they decided to simplify things for themselves and just give them the auto attack thing instead, so that Paladins could focus on being buff bots. You see, Paladin buffs were really good, but they only lasted for 5 minutes, and you can only place one on a person at a time. So having a Paladin in your raid meant everyone else in your raid could do more damage and healing, but that also meant the Paladin spent most of their global cooldowns just buffing everyone else, making them one of the only pure support classes to exist in the game, which could be another big reason why they were changed to focus on auto attacks instead of having an active rotation with Crusader Strike, because they wanted the Paladin to use those global cooldowns on buffing the raid instead of using them on damaging moves. Of course, the seal mechanic wasn't a huge success either, as it was all but removed after Vanilla WoW since, while it did have a few fans, it wasn't very good, and I'm sure everyone probably would have liked it more if it just did a little bit more damage or, was a little bit more involved than having to press 2 buttons every 8 seconds. So if you go back and watch any beta footage of World of Warcraft that has Paladins in it, you can actually see Crusader Strike on the debuff bar of the video I'm showing right now, as a shaman is going out and fighting a Paladin in the open world, and you can see the Crusader Strike debuff on him as he's killing the higher level Paladin. But Vanilla WoW was already taking a long time to come out. It was in development for 5 years before they launched, so they started just rushing things towards the end, but it's kind of a wonder why they decided to make such a drastic change to the Paladin class 2 weeks before the game launched, which kind of segues into this next section of the video. Now, outside of the mechanical reasons that people theorize, these aren't, confirmed in any way, about why they removed Crusader Strike and Holy Strike, there's also the rumors of 2 game developers joining around the same time the Seal system was added. 2 famous EverQuest players named Furor and Tiggle joined the WoW development team at around the time Paladins got this drastic change to their damaging rotation. And the change to the Paladin class was so last second that even in the official Vanilla WoW guide, which was sold in stores, they featured the Paladin old class systems, including Crusader Strike, Holy Strike, and calling their blessings seals. And you see, these 2 players were infamous for absolutely hating hybrid classes, to the point where they would stage protests in-game whenever they found out a hybrid class was doing anything except being a buff bot, or something like that. They just really didn't like the fact that a hybrid class could do as much damage as a pure DPS class, and they were well known for wanting hybrid classes to basically be terrible as a tax for being able to do a whole bunch of different things. Which would make sense why Paladins lost their fun rotation as soon as they joined and were given the infamous seal system for Vanilla WoW. Although I'd call these just rumors instead of what actually happened, because there isn't confirmation this is why it happened. And in fact, Ghostcrawler is largely credited with changing paladins to how they were in Vanilla WoW. And Ghostcrawler is also the person who wanted hybrid classes to perform just as well as pure DPS classes. So what probably happened was Ghostcrawler just wanted to try out this change with the paladins and see how it worked. Saw that it failed in Vanilla WoW, and then changed his philosophy going forward to try to push all classes to basically being equal. So, all that being said, there's not too much credit to the Furor or Tiggle changing Vanilla WoW paladins into a garbage spec, although this wouldn't be a video about beta ret paladins without mentioning this very famous rumor. I just couldn't find any confirmation for any of these rumors besides lots of speculations on forums and stuff, which is usually the case for very famous WoW rumors. So, there you have it. The reason paladins only had one damaging ability was because it was given to them at the last second without any kind of testing like all the other classes got, as well as a whole bunch of rumors and theories as to why they made this decision in the first place. After Vanilla WoW, Blizzard changed paladins to no longer be buff bots. They allowed them to actually tank, and gave them competitive DPS. Arguably, it was much better than it was in Vanilla WoW though. Did you know that there were plans to have a huge server-wide questline for Warlocks similar to the AQ event? The event would have involved Warlock players needing to perform a global collection effort to rebuild Medivh spellbook, and after they completed that, they would perform a group ritual to open the Dark Portal, while players on the server protected them from enemy attacks. Now, the source for all this was from an interview from a Vanilla WoW developer, and the main reason why they cut this was because of the AQ Opening the Gates event. Because you see, they did something similar to this with the opening of Encourage, where players could go on a massive quest line, literally the biggest quest line in the game's history, which also required the server to contribute a whole bunch of supplies, which would culminate into ringing the gong that opened the gates to the raid instance. And during the opening of the gates, there would be a server-wide event for 10 hours, where elite monsters would pour through the portal and overrun the zone of Silithus. And there would be bosses that dropped loot, so there was many players scrambling to kill as many of them as possible in the time allotted to them. And there was also crystals that spawned around the world, which would spawn mobs and bosses that also dropped loot. So everyone in the world participated in this event. And it was worth participating as you could get gear from it. Now, this all sounds great, but the reason why they never did something like this ever again was because this completely crashed servers while the event was going on. Because you see, this event was a limited time thing, and could only happen one time per server. So you had 10 hours to do this one event, otherwise you'd never be able to do it again. And under those kinds of time constraints, pretty much everyone tried to participate if they could, and the servers weren't really built to have that many people in one zone at a time, or just that many people online at the same time killing a whole bunch of monsters. So most servers were basically just unplayable during the opening of the gates, which kind of killed the whole point of the event being a limited time anyway, as if you couldn't log in to do the event, or if you got disconnected every time you tried to get closer to Silithus, then the event was basically wasted on you anyway. And since the opening of the gates was such a disaster from a developer point of view, players still love the event and think fondly back to it to this day, but Blizzard doesn't like it when people aren't able to play the game due to hardware limitations. So they weren't happy with the event, and they never tried anything like it again. And even canceled the planned Warlock event, which most likely would have been the event for the launch of the Burning Crusade, but they just didn't have the hardware to do something like that again, so they just scrapped it. In some of the early beta builds of WoW, there were Dark Portal placeholders in random parts of the world, including one located underwater off the coast of Ajara. For many years, the WoW community theorized that Blizzard was just using the Dark Portal as a placeholder for dungeons, raids, or battleground entrances. Basically, since the Dark Portal was placed in so many different parts of the world at random, which ended up being near those kinds of entrances anyway, it was a pretty safe assumption to make. And the only placeholder that didn't really make sense was the one located underwater. But they did have a planned battleground in that zone, and it was heavily Naga based, so a lot of people just thought it was a placeholder for the entrance to that battleground. But then, with the WoW Diary book, we found out that those were not placeholders for dungeon entrances at all, and were actually potential locations for the Dark Portal to be placed. Now, I mentioned this in a previous video briefly, and a lot of people were very apprehensive about that explanation, and insisted that they were actually just placeholders, because the Dark Portal has a very set location in lore already that predates Vanilla WoW. But here's the thing with how they created Vanilla WoW. They were very flexible with the lore and the zone layouts. They were absolutely willing to move the Dark Portal somewhere else if they thought it was cooler. And a lot of the lore of zones was done by other people besides Chris Metzen, who basically wrote most of WoW's lore, and was being designed alongside Warcraft 3 in the early stages, so their lore could be changed at a moment's notice. Taking a quote from the WoW Diary, Chris Metzen and the art team only vaguely knew the level ranges, which were finalized only in the last year of development. In this fluid state of indecision, even major lore objects like the Dark Portal bounced around. Chris decided to move it out of the Tree of Life area. No one on the team called it Tedrasil, letting the World Tree become its own area. He planned to move the Dark Portal to Ajara because the game designers were thinking of making it a high-level area anyway, and it was also cool to have the Dark Portal submerged in water. Eventually, Chris decided on putting it in the Blasted Lands because there wasn't really anything else interesting going on there. So, based on this quote, the Dark Portal could have absolutely ended up underwater, as I think that's even where they had it in the Warcraft movie. So it is an idea that Blizzard liked, but ultimately they just put it in the Blasted Lands, partly because there's nothing else going on there, but I think it's also partly because that's just kind of where it was supposed to be located in lore previously anyway, and they just decided to not move the Dark Portal somewhere else. They also eventually ended up scrapping the battleground in Ajara anyway, and they also converted Tedrasil into the Night Elf starting zone instead of making it into some kind of max level zone, or an entrance to the Dark Portal. Alright, and that's it for this little micro fact about WoW. I know I've covered this topic briefly in another video before, but I thought it'd be a good idea to expand upon it a little bit more, as a lot of people just straight up didn't believe me in the other video. Another thing John Stat says in the book is that many players have theories and ideas about why a lot of things happened in World of Warcraft, and like 99% of them were wrong, and a lot of decisions were done on whims or for pretty mundane reasons actually. For some very dedicated wall jumpers and explorers in Vanilla WoW, they were able to discover an early version of Hellfire Peninsula, which was the first zone in the Burning Crusade expansion, which led many people to believe that Blizzard had planned to add Outland to Vanilla WoW instead of it being its own expansion. And there's even some videos online of people exploring the area, and it seems like there's a lot that was done, and a lot of its inspirations were used with the actual Hellfire Peninsula. But according to an interview with a Vanilla WoW developer, that early Hellfire map was most likely just someone playing around with assets, as they never had any plans to add it to Vanilla WoW. And in fact, they didn't even really want to go to Outlands as their first expansion. The first expansion they wanted to have was the South Seas, with pirates and stuff, because the Pirates of the Caribbean movies came out and were super popular at the time. So we could have gotten the BFA expansion, with players going to Kulturas and Zandalar, as the first expansion, rather than like the 7th. And the reason they didn't do that was because of hardware limitations. They literally couldn't add any more maps to the original world map, so they had to create another world tab, which is the main reason why they decided to go with Outlands. That way, they could just put it all in its own world tab, and they could just have players teleport to it when they went to the zones. As if you didn't know, all of Outlands is on the same map as the Blood Elf and Draenei starting zones. If you're able to go out of bounds and go way far into the Fatigue Zone, you could potentially fly into the Blood Elf starting zone, the Ghostlands, or the Draenei starting zone and its extended zone afterwards. Basically, all of the zones added in the Burning Crusade took place on this one world map, because they just didn't have the hardware to put them on their own yet. Now, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on this, but apparently this was the best way for them to do it at the time. Eventually, they got server upgrades where this was no longer a big deal, and that's why the next expansion took place in Northrend, which is another map on the Azeroth map, and then they didn't really have the limitations on the Azeroth map after that. So they eventually did the South Seas expansion, which is the current expansion we're in right now, basically. Now, it's a wonder why this never-used version of Hellfire Peninsula snuck its way into the game. But hey, they did have the developer playgrounds in the game files as well, that you could technically get to if you were very creative about using game mechanics, or exploiting. So it's not too far-fetched to believe that the Hellfire Peninsula map was also just one of those assets. Although it is kind of hard to believe that they had no plans to add Outland maps, considering they did have plans for the Emerald Dream, which was also a cut thing that they couldn't do correctly. But apparently they had no such plans for Outlands of Vanilla WoW, and Outlands wasn't even their first choice as an expansion. The quest will be available at level 16 and send you to remote parts of the world to gather things, and druids do not get travel form until level 30, nor mounts until 40, so you have to walk everywhere on foot. No matter which fact.
With a 17-point win, America becomes a live free or die country.
Recently, and for no reason at all, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I
action you start on, both will send you to Moonglade for the first part of the quest. Druids learn to teleport to Moonglade at level 10, so this is no problem. Once at Moonglade, you'll be asked to retrieve a bauble from the bottom of the lake, and be given a 30-minute timer to complete the task. This one's pretty easy, as all you do is go to the lake in the middle of the zone, swim to the bottom, and then get the item needed. Then you have to head over to Remulus and use the bauble, which completes the quest. After that, you turn it into the quest giver, who is right next to Remulus. She will then send you on to the next part of the quest, which is to collect 2 halves of the pendant of the sea lion. But she won't tell you where they are, and instead tells you to talk to the locals in Moonglade to find their locations. Eventually, you'll find out that one is located in Darkshore, and the other is located in Westfall. The Darkshore one is probably the easiest, as you can just take the flight path from Moonglade to Aberdeen, and then run north to the location. After swimming for a bit, you'll come into contact with 2 large rocks, and a bunch of level 17 and 13 threshers swimming around them. If doing this at level, you'll have to be careful to avoid them or only fight one at a time, but it's a relatively short swim down for the item you need. Assuming you knew where it was, mind you. Remember, it was intended for you to figure out where these items were located by asking NPCs for clues and figuring it out for yourself, which I imagine was quite difficult, as this is kind of a farish swim from shore. Now, for the next part, Westfall. Getting to Westfall for the first time as a night elf on foot was probably the most time-consuming part of this process. So, what you had to do was go back to Aberdeen and go to the docks, and then take the boat to Menethil Harbor. Later on in WoW, this boat was changed to go to Stormwind, but in Vanilla WoW, it was to Menethil in the wetlands. Once you got there, you were going to have to run through the wetlands, which was a level 20-ish zone. So there were tons of nearly level 20 mobs everywhere, which at level 16 did give you some trouble. So you had to be careful as you ran across the wetlands to Dun Algas, a little mountain path needed to get to Dun Moreau. And in the mountain path were level 20 orc guards, who were almost impossible to avoid and could kill you easily if you weren't very careful. But once you got past that and made it to Dun Moreau, all you had to do was run to Ironforge, and then take the tram to Stormwind. From Stormwind, you could run through Elwyn Forest down to Westfall. Luckily, all of these places are in your level zone, so not as dangerous as the wetlands. Once in Westfall, you had to swim to this location on the map, which was in the fatigue zone, and you had to swim very far down to the box with the item you needed. There were also elite sharks that passed this area, so you had to keep high alert as they could easily kill you. It was very easy to die of fatigue when you got too close to it too, but luckily there was an air bubble fissure right next to the lockbox that you could swim to instead to regather your air, and then get the item from the box. Once you got the item, you could then simply teleport back to Moonglade and turn in the quest. And now you know how to use aquatic form, which, ironically, would have been very useful for doing the quest, and is incredibly useless outside of it, as most things did not take place in water in Vanilla WoW. Now, for the Horde version, it was a lot easier. The first part was the same as the Alliance version, in that you had to swim to the bottom of the lake in Moonglade and get the item within 30 minutes. Then you had to ask around for clues as to where you could find the 2 pieces for the next part of the quest. One was located in the north of the Barrens in the middle of the little sludge pool, with the only thing to look out for was an elite sludge that passed nearby, which was easily avoided. The next item was a lot harder to find and was located off the coast of Silverpine Forest. So you needed to run to Orgrimmar, take the Zeppelin to Undercity, and then run to this point on the map. The only real indicator of where the box is located for people who didn't know exactly where to go was to look at the shipwrecked boat on the shore and then swim directly out from that point and hit the edge of the fatigue zone. and then swim down. Then, once you got the item, either res if you died of fatigue or drowning damage, and then teleport to Moonglade to turn it in, and you're done. No running halfway across the world through high-level zones like the Alliance counterpart. So, it was much easier. And that's it for as far as the aquatic form quests go. On a scale of harder than the water totem class quests, I'd give this one a 7 water totems out of 10. Call of Water was infinitely more terrible than this one, but that doesn't mean it wasn't still a pain in the ass nonetheless, especially the Alliance portion. Eventually, Blizzard changed the boat in Darkshore to go to Stormwind instead of the wetlands, which made the Alliance portion just as easy as the Horde counterpart, so it was nerfed a little bit later on. But it was still a lot of traveling for a low-level quest that gave you arguably your most useless form, especially since you had to walk the whole way. When the WoW developers were first planning out which classes players would be allowed to play, Druids were not on that original shortlist, but Blizzard did have 9 classes planned in the original list. Basically, warriors, paladins, shamans, priests, hunters, mages, and warlocks were all on the design table from the beginning. And in addition to those 7, they also had assassins and rune masters. Assassins eventually got converted into rogues, as they even have a spec called assassination, and rune masters were never actually added to the game. Now, the idea behind rune masters was to have an unarmed fighter who had runes on their body which gave them magical properties, and they were kind of like an enchanter, but a whole class based around enchanting their bodies in order to do magic or physical feats. And they had even planned on having Rune Masters being one of the hero classes once they eventually decided to not include it in vanilla. And he would be alongside the Death Knights and Necromancers. And that also means they had planned on adding Necromancers to the game at some point, just as a hero class which was supposed to be better than normal classes. So they never actually went with Rune Masters, but they did like the ideas behind some of its flavor. So they kind of split it up into the Death Knight and Monk classes that were eventually added. Death Knights have a rune system to use their magic, similar to how they wanted Rune Masters to work, and Monks are an unarmed class, who do basically the other side of what Rune Masters were supposed to be. And then they eventually just added Druids because that's a fantasy staple, and there were already some pretty notable lore figures that are Druids, so it only made sense for them to add them. And funny enough, Druids were not the last class added into the game, or programmed in anyway. They just weren't on the original design table for classes. Hunters were actually the last class to be added, or programmed into the game, and even then, they only barely made it in. And their design philosophy with Druids was that they wanted them to shapeshift a whole bunch, so they gave Druids a whole bunch of abilities that could only be used in their various shapeshifting forms. And they'd intended for players to be constantly shapeshifting in battle in order to do their full rotations and stuff. But there was one little caveat to this that they had kind of overlooked. Shapeshifting cost way too much mana to do that. And the final talent point in their feral tree for a time was a talent that reduced the shapeshifting cost by 25%. Which did not alleviate this problem at all, I might add. Shapeshifting still cost a ton of mana, but Blizzard was happy if a class was good at least one role in a raid, and Druids could function as a healer in raids, as they gave innervates to priests or other healers, so they considered them good to go, even if the design philosophy they were supposed to be doing in raids didn't actually work. You know, the whole shapeshifting a whole bunch of things. Eventually, later on in the game's history, they did a much better job of encouraging Druids to shapeshift more in combat, but generally only in PvP, as PvP players would shift into bear form in order to tank damage or to use their stun ability, and then shift into travel form to run away or go behind pillars, then go into human form to heal up. So if you want the true shape-shifting Druid fantasy, you kind of have to play PvP for it, as in raids and dungeons you basically just stay in one form the whole time. If you've ever run Blackrock Depths in Classic WoW, you'll know that the dungeon is massive, probably the biggest dungeon in the game, and it even has the raid entrance to Molten Core inside of it. But did you know they had plans to make it even bigger? In the Dark Iron Highway section of the dungeon, there's a boss at the end of the road in front of a big unused door called Belgar, and the door was put there as an excuse to have a road leading to the city. The thought was that what was behind it might eventually be turned into another raid, and in the boss dungeon journal it says, "The monstrous molten giant Belgar lumbers across the Dark Iron Highway, a stunning feat of dwarven engineering carved into Blackrock Depths. Ragnaros pulled the giant from the heart of the Firelands to guard a massive sealed door at one end of the highway. According to legend, only the Fire Lord and the Dark Iron Clan's highest ranking members know what lies beyond the mysterious gate. Now currently, there is nothing behind the door, and there has never been any mention about what's actually behind it. But according to an interview with John Statz, the level designer who created Blackrock Depths, they did have plans to put something there.
2024 will determine America's future for a generation. We can't look back to the past to lead us forward. It's time for a new generation. That leader, Nikki Haley. Nikki Haley has the courage, the strength, and conviction. She's a proven conservative with real solutions to restore the American dream. Nikki Haley is the only candidate who can turn the page on the past and beat Joe Biden. The momentum building, the movement starting. Nikki Haley for America's future.
Wix is your platform to perform on. A complete portfolio solution means you can tell your unique story with confidence. From choosing a name and design that fits your vision, to bringing your projects to life. Custom themes and layouts. Fine-tunable details and tons of animation options. Deliver an immersive experience. Spend less time on admin with live chat, forms, a detailed contact database, and one go-to inbox for all your messages. All while a powerful SEO toolkit lays the groundwork to maximize your reach. The platform is built for evolution, from a community building blog to a streamlined booking solution, or profit-boosting e-com store. You can shape your online presence from start to scale. Go to Wix.com and start today.
And that's why they had this big room leading to a door that was closed, to add mystery to the whole event for when they would eventually add the extra dungeon in this place. So why didn't they ever go back to this room and add a dungeon here? Well, because the dungeon was already too big as is. There was already so much going on in there, and there was already a raid entrance in the dungeon that the designers thought they had gone a little bit too far, and that maybe they had added too much to this one place. So adding an additional instance to the dungeon was probably not the best idea, considering they already had so much else going on in the mountain. With Blackrock Depths, the lower and upper spires, plus Molten Core and the Blackwing Lair, I can see why they decided not to add an additional dungeon when they already had so much going on in the mountain, and instead prioritize those resources onto making something new.
In this video, we'll go over 10 equipable items which had weird or unique effects in Vanilla WoW. And at number 10, we have the Loofah. This was a trinket which had the effect to remove one bleed effect. Now, seeing as trinkets were kind of rare and hard to get, you didn't really lose much for having this equipped, and using it to get rid of a bleed from a warrior or rogue in PvP, or the odd raid or dungeon boss who applied a bleed, was pretty good. So it was a unique trinket with an effect that was pretty useful, despite the fact it gave no other stats. Then again, a lot of trinkets in vanilla didn't really have stats on them either, and would sometimes only provide a unique effect. The trinket was easy to get too. All you had to do was complete one quest in the Searing Gorge, which required you to go around and kill 20 dinosaurs. And there originally was no limit on the bleed it would remove. So when the Burning Crusade came out and one of the bosses in the new raid, Morose and Karazhan, used a hard-hitting bleed as one of its mechanics, tanks were using this vanilla WoW trinket in order to remove it. So they added a restriction to the trinket, where it would only remove a bleed effect applied from a target level 60 or below. Because outside of this trinket, there are no ways to remove bleeds outside of a dwarf's racial ability stone form, and straight up immunity spells which remove everything. Bleeds are one of the few common dot types which can't be removed by healers. Although in Legion, they did add a homage item in the game called the Feathered Loofah. It was an item that you could create with First Aid that had the effect to heal for a little bit and remove bleed effects, but only while you're on the Broken Isles. And with the removal of First Aid in BFA, this item was just added to Tailors along with all other First Aid crafts. And at number 9, we have the 6 Demon Bag. This was an item with an on-use effect which would have one of 6 random effects. 3 of its effects were to shoot out a spell, 2 of its effects were CCs, Its last effect was to summon a Fell Hunter pet for you for a little bit. Of its 6 effects, its 3 spell effects were a lot more common than the other 3. So every time you used it, it had a higher than normal chance to shoot a fireball, a frostbolt, which would slow the target for 5 seconds as well, or a chain lightning, which would chain to 2 other targets. And then its other 3 more rarer effects was a cyclone-like ability, which was just a straight up stun, a polymorph, and then the Fell Hunter pet summon. Since trinkets were pretty rare, and you had a good chance for its effects to just do damage, and it only had a 3-minute cooldown, this item, despite having a weird effect, wasn't half bad as far as DPS trinkets go. Obviously, there were much better ones in the game, but if you had this one, it at least had some fun effects on it if it didn't do damage. Number 8, the Gnomish Mind Control Cap. This engineering item had the effect to possibly mind control an enemy target, which would then allow you to control them like a warlock or hunter pet. But if you already had a pet out, you would have to dismiss your pet first in order to use this ability. But there was also a few catches to it. After patch 1.11, you could only use this item on targets out of combat. Also, you had to be an engineer with a high engineering skill in order to use the item. But despite its name though, you did not need to be a gnomish engineer. Any engineer could use this helmet. The helm had a 30-minute cooldown, so not something that could be used very often. And as probably the biggest caveat to this thing, it had a chance to fail, which was pretty common with a lot of engineering items. In fact, that's still kind of the case today. If this thing failed, it had a chance to just not do anything, or mind control yourself and put you under the control of the mob you were attempting to mind control. And because engineering items had a pretty high chance to fail in Vanilla WoW, this was not used as a reliable form of CC, and instead, just kind of a fun item with occasional niche uses. Number 7, the Horned Viking Helmet. This helmet had the on-use effect to charge an enemy and incapacitate them for 30 seconds, but it would also knock you down and stun you for a bit. A 30-second CC is actually an incredibly useful effect, to the point where a lot of warriors would farm the helmet in order to use it in PvP, and of course had some niche PvE uses as well, since CC were heavily used in dungeons and raids. The helmet itself dropped from Eric the Swift in Ulduar, and is only available to Horde players, as the NPC is friendly to Alliance. And since it was located inside Ulduar, a not max level dungeon, warriors could solo this place to grab it, if they were smart about it, as the item dropped from one of 3 of the Lost Vikings. So if you attacked one of them, the other 2 were going to join in. Soloing lower level dungeons back Vanilla WoW was a lot harder than it is today, even if you had about 20 levels on the place. And since the helmet had such a good effect, after Vanilla WoW, they gave the helmet a little restriction that it could only be used on targets level 60 and lower, basically. Number 6, Skull of Impending Doom. This was an offhand item that has the effect to increase your run speed by 60% for 10 seconds, which was a pretty good effect back when not all classes had speed increasers, and the few that did had incredibly long cooldowns or restrictions placed on them. And the offhand only had a 3-minute cooldown, but when used, it would deal damage to you and then drain mana over its duration. So the offhand worked very similar to modern day Burning Rush, a talent that warlocks have which increase their run speed but deals damage to them while it's active. If anything, Burning Rush was probably inspired by the Skull of Impending Doom. In order to get this offhand, you had to complete a 4-part quest chain, which had you go to a dungeon and around the world killing things. The quest would start in the Badlands from a dwarf, who would send you to Ulduar to grab a tablet, which despite the quest text, didn't actually require you to go inside Ulduar, as the tablet was located right outside the entrance. Then you would go to another quest giver in either Ironforge or Undercity, depending on your faction, who would then send you to Dustwallow Marsh, Stranglethorn, and the Alteric Mountains to collect 3 items from 3 elite mobs. Then you'd be sent back to the dwarf in the Badlands and you'd receive your skull. Even with the drawbacks of the skull, it was still a pretty useful item just for the speed increase it gave you, and even saw some niche uses in PvP, on classes that can equip an offhand normally. For the Burning Crusade, the item received an update to drain 60% of your mana and health when you used it, instead of a fixed amount like it did in Vanilla WoW. This was most likely done so it couldn't be abused by the new health values that players had, keeping its drawback as an actual drawback to it. And then in the Cataclysm, you can no longer obtain this item. So if you have one, it still works like the TBC version to this day. And at number 5, we have the Freezing Band. This was a world drop epic ring that had a 1% chance whenever you were hit to freeze the target for 5 seconds, and inflict a little bit of frost damage. It also gave some frost resist and increased the damage of your frost spells. Now, the unique thing about this item is absolutely that on-hit chance of freezing a target for 5 seconds, as this freeze was treated basically like a stun, and would just freeze them in a block of ice for 5 seconds when activated, had no internal cooldown, and did stack with another freezing band. As this ring was not unique equip, you could have 2 of them on at the same time to double the chances of getting freeze procs. The only thing that might have prevented this from happening though, was how you obtain this ring. It was a world drop epic item, which is about the hardest way to obtain an item in the game, as you just have to get really lucky to obtain this from a random drop. So usually, the best way to obtain one was to just buy it off the auction house for a crap ton of gold. And even then, there was no guarantees that there would be one on the auction house. But if you were very rich and you played on a server with these being sold, you could obtain 2 of them and have fun with your enemies randomly being stunned whenever they hit you. And since the targets were treated as frozen, there was lots of synergy with frost mages and their shatter talent. And at number 4, we have the Thunder Brew Boot Flask. This was another trinket item which had 2 unusual effects tied to it. The first being, when you used it, you would breathe fire for 5 seconds, which would give you a nice little AoE. And I've heard reports that this AoE could be used without a target and wouldn't aggro nearby guards if used on low-level players in towns. Its second effect is that it would get you drunk, which could...
The fights between Donald Trump and Nikki Haley.
On January 23rd, vote Nikki Haley.
When Doug and Andre came to TurboTax,
we navigated a turbulent housing market by
Buying a motorhome.
I made their move count. We've guaranteed 100% accurate taxes for millions of new homeowners. Intuit TurboTax.
Worlds bathed in the Maker's flames, their denizens fading without so much as a whimper. Entire planetary
be a good or bad thing, depending on who you ask, and all on a measly 30-minute cooldown. Vanilla WoW had incredibly long cooldowns on a lot of their items for almost no reason. That was kind of the name of the game back then. Everything had long cooldowns in other games, and if anything, WoW's cooldowns were pretty reasonable in comparison. You rarely see abilities or items with cooldowns this long today, when that was kind of the norm back then, as you may have noticed with some of the other items on the list. Now, the way to acquire this item required a lot of legwork. You had to complete a 5-part cross-continental journey in order to complete the quest chain, which awarded this trinket. So let's go over it. First part of the quest chain required you to talk to a dwarf in Westfall that required you to be level 40 in order to accept the quest. Westfall was a low-level zone, so it's almost impossible you found this on your own while leveling normally, and also unlikely you found this quest when you're at max level, since the quest didn't appear for low-level players or max-level players. And the quest giver himself is kind of hidden in an out-of-the-way location. This is kind of a secretive quest to accept. Anyways, the first part of the quest required you to go to Stranglethorn Vale, in the middle of a Naga camp in order to get some holy spring water. The second part of the quest chain required you to get 3 separate materials. One located in the Swamp of Sorrows, another located in Tanaris, and the last all the way in the hinterlands. Then you'd be asked to get 1 true silver bar, which you could just buy off the auction house. And after that, you'd be sent on another journey, this time to Feralis in order to get a branch. And then for the final part of the quest, you'd be sent to the Syrian Gorge in order to get a piece of oak. Then, after you return to Westfall, you'd finally get your trinket. There's some speculation that this was meant to be a quest for players newly obtaining their mounts, to give them a reason to run around the world with their newfound mounts. And that's why it had them go to like 5 different parts of the world. A speculation that was most likely entirely correct, as in the WoW Diary book, a book in which one of the WoW vanilla developers talks about what went into making the game, they do talk about how they really wanted cross-continental quest for all classes at level 40, so they'd have a reason to use their new mounts. This quest is a good example of what they had planned for every class, instead of just a few of them getting quests like this. Number 3, the Spectral Essence. This trinket has the effect to allow you to interact with ghosts inside of one town. This trinket was pretty standard for quest-like items and special effects, as trinkets in vanilla WoW were not very commonplace, and good trinkets were pretty rare. Your trinket spot was usually fine to equip something there without hindering your character all that much. In order to get the trinket, you had to complete a quest which would send you into Skullomance to kill a rare elite, and burn 2 bodies. Then you'd get this trinket which would allow you to talk to the folks of Ciridaro, and even buy some unique items from a vendor, which could only be seen with this trinket or the Eye of Divinity, a trinket only priests could equip that dropped from a boss in Molten Core. The trinket didn't have any stats or do anything else. This is basically just the precursor to quest items, which did special things. Blizzard would usually just put them on trinkets that you had to equip. And at number 2, we have the Dark Moon card Twisty Nether. This was a Dark Moon trinket which had the effect which would only have a chance to activate when you died. Basically, it gave you a 10% chance to resurrect after dying with 20% health and mana. And when the trinket rezzed you, it worked kind of like having a soul stone on you, in which you could choose to accept a resurrection or not. Now, seeing as this trinket only had a 10% chance, it was not at all reliable, and not really worth the trinket slot in raids or dungeons. Its uses were basically just for solo content to occasionally save you a run back to your corpse, or if you literally didn't have any other trinket. It at least had the potential to be sometimes useful in raids or dungeons. Now, this trinket didn't actually see very much use until arenas were added to the game in the Burning Crusade, in which people would equip this trinket in order to sometimes come back to life in an arena match, which could single-handedly help you win the game. Usually, after one person dies in arena, the team which secured the kill will basically treat it as if they've already won, and maybe let their guard down a little bit. So seeing someone res back up real quick to join the fight is all it could really take in order to turn the tide of the battle back in your favor. And as far as I know, this trinket still works in arenas today. Maybe. I tried looking it up and couldn't really find any confirmation, but I also didn't find anything saying that it didn't. And at number 1, we have the Hook of the Master Angler. This is a trinket that had the on-use effect to turn you into a fish and allow underwater breathing and an increased swim speed. Kind of like the artifact fishing pole effect, which turns you into a fish and allows you to swim faster. Except instead of having to equip something in your weapon slot, this one only required you to equip it in your trinket slot. Unusual for a trinket like this trinket actually didn't have a cooldown in vanilla WoW, where usually all fun abilities had incredibly long cooldowns. This one, you could just turn to a fish whenever you wanted. Well, outside of waiting 30 seconds after equipping the trinket anyway. The trinket is a reward from the Stranglethorn Fishing Extravaganza event and winning the grand prize. So not many people could get it, considering the event is only held once a week, and basically only one person per server can win per week. You can still win this trinket today, but you do have to get first place in the fishing tournament, which is pretty difficult, unless you're on a server that literally has no one else trying the tournament that week, which is doubtful since the tournament also has a prize for an heirloom ring item, which is an incredibly useful item as it gives you an extra 5% experience. And since the item is so useful, that means lots of people are still doing this tournament today in order to try to get one. But that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to win it. The first time I ever tried doing the tournament, I won 2nd place. Not good enough to get this trinket, but it was good enough to get the heirloom ring, which is what I actually wanted anyway. In this video, we'll go over 10 things which existed in vanilla WoW, but won't be in classic WoW for one reason or another. And at number 10, we'll have the constantly changing game. This is on the number 10 spot because it's kind of obvious. In vanilla WoW, lots of spells and abilities changed constantly over time in that one expansion, whereas classic WoW will be taking place in basically the last patch, after all of those changes already took place. Let's take Power Word Shield as an example. If you take a look at its vanilla WoW only changes, you'll see that in patch 1.2, it was changed to only work on party members, as Power Word Shield is a bubble you can place on other people which will absorb a set amount of damage. Being able to cast it on a whole raid would be pretty good, so they limited it to just party members.
Then in patch 1.3, they changed it to be castable on all raid targets, making it much better. In patch 1.6, they allowed Power Word Shield to absorb damage from mana burn-like effects, which hints that it didn't work on all damage and only some forms of it. In patch 1.7, they fixed a bug that would cause Power Word Shield to heal Warlocks when they had Soul Link up. In patch 1.10, they allowed Power Word Shield to actually scale from your gear, which would only increase your healing previously. As before that, it only counted as an absorb, which was technically not a heal back then. So if you count that, that was 4 changes and 1 bug fix, all before patch 1.12. In which case, Classic WoW will only have the final version of that spell. We won't be able to live through all those changes. The same could be said about some other abilities. Power Word Shield is just a good example because it had quite a few changes as they tried to figure out what they wanted it to be. And at number 9, we have trial accounts being able to talk to people. In Vanilla WoW, if you created a trial account, you could talk to other players. Trial accounts in Vanilla WoW just restricted what level you could get to, but basically allowed you to do everything else. This was changed because gold farmers took advantage of trial accounts and did all sorts of things with them. Some people might even remember how they used to use trial accounts to spell out gold farming websites with the dead bodies of those trial accounts. So of course they can't allow trial accounts to talk to people to give a classic WoW experience, because then people would just take advantage of it like they did back then. Also, I'm pretty sure trial accounts are just called starter editions now, as you can now play WoW for free up to level 20 for as long as you want. There's no longer a time limit on it, but you still can't whisper people though, unless you have them added to your friends list first. And at number 8, we have, tentatively, the Corrupted Blood incident. This is tentative because Blizzard said they might recreate the Corrupted Blood incident, but in that case, it still won't really be the same. For those of you not in the know, the Corrupted Blood incident was when a player found a bug where if their pets got the Corrupted Blood debuff on them from Hakar, they could dismiss their pet in the raid to keep that debuff, and then summon their pet back in the middle of a city, who would then spread that debuff to other players, which would instantly kill low-level players and infect the NPCs and high-level players. And then these new infected players would infect other people, until an entire city was killed. It was such a famous incident that virus researchers use
91 charges, federal trials. While Trump is stuck in a courtroom, Biden-Harris will dump hundreds of millions into attacking him. And Donald Trump, too many distractions, too much uncertainty, to risk losing again.
it as an example of how an outbreak would affect a populated city. Of course, Blizzard fixed the bug, where the debuff could no longer be saved on pets or work outside the raid instance. So if they were to recreate the Corrupted Blood incident, I'm not sure if it would really have the same effect. People would just go around killing each other for fun, and I doubt too many people would try to have quarantine zones like they did during the original one, or try their best to stop it. Or maybe they would, I don't know. I don't really see them intentionally trying to break the game like this for a few days. But they didn't completely rule out recreating it either. And at number 7, we have the anticipation of a class patch. In Vanilla WoW, Blizzard used major patches as an excuse to try and balance one class at a time. Since a lot of the classes were unbalanced, they most likely will stay unbalanced if they're trying to keep true to Vanilla WoW. Every major patch Blizzard did attempted to fix one class, and would usually give them a whole bunch of buffs or fix abilities that no one used. And people loved waiting for the next class patch, because maybe their class was going to be the one to get a whole bunch of buffs next. Unless you were a shaman, they weren't too happy about their class patch and told their community manager to get hit by a bus, which became its own infamous incident. But since Classic WoW will be starting at patch 1.12, that's after all of the class patches have already happened. And since they're trying to create the experience to be as close to 1.12 as possible, I don't see sweeping class patches happening. And at number 6, we have servers crashing constantly. You see, during the first couple of weeks of WoW, playing the game was nearly impossible because of how many people were logging in, and Blizzard wasn't expecting the game to be as popular as it turned out to be. They didn't have stable servers to fit all the demand they had for the game, and even then, they still worked on their servers over time to try to make them better and better, and with them testing out stress test stuff during the Classic WoW beta already, and with how smooth the launch of BFA had, it's pretty safe to assume there will be very few server crashes once the game actually goes live. which, while that may make it a better play and experience, that's something